God is the one who does the work in the sacraments. It's why we can baptize infants, right? Because it's God who's regenerating. Not because the infant believes it, but because God's doing the work. Somebody who is ill and doesn't have all their mental faculties can receive the sacrament because it's God's blessing. It's not dependent upon whether that person understands it. As a matter of fact, if we had to understand everything about the sacraments before we could receive them, I think we might be in trouble, right? Because
we'd be coming up a little short.
Yeah, we'd probably be coming up a little short, and I think that the idea of worthiness has been a hazard throughout the church. There was a time in the Western Church, particularly before the Reformation, and in the Roman Church afterwards until the 20th century, where reception of the sacrament was considered a quarterly or less often thing because of the idea of worthiness. In the Orthodox Church, for the most part, in the East, reception of communion is a couple of times a year. Again, the sense of unworthiness and having to go in and make your auricular confession to a priest before receiving every time, that there was a sense of it. Pius X was, in the Roman Church, was the Pope who opened up more frequent reception to the Roman Church by encouraging it, not only on Sundays but on weekdays. And of course, one of the reactions of Anglicanism in the 39 Articles was to get away from the idea that only the priest was to receive communion and the people were just to look, right, to hear Mass, but rather they were to participate in the service as well as be participants in the sacrament by receiving more frequently than, well, in a good church every week, of course, and in other Anglican churches it was sometimes monthly, but depending on where you went. But there was certainly a desire for that. So it's God who's doing the work, and He's condescending to help us. Who are we to say no? The other side of that, receptionism and subjectivism, the other side of that issue is that we have a lot of people who think that Christ is present on the altar because we believe it. There's this sense that this is a community memorial meal, so therefore it's the faith of the believers that makes Christ present, rather than the objective work of God in performing the sacrament. And that's helpful. We'll talk about it when we get to the sacraments, but that's helpful because if you have a priest who's perhaps not the cleanest guy out there, God is just using him. It's not valid because the priest is absolutely perfect. As a matter of fact, if you meet the perfect priest, please let me go. I want to join his parish. Okay? Oh, Father Fraser, thank you. I thank thee, I'm not like other people. It's hard to have a virtue. Well, that's the problem with humility. You can't brag about how good you are at it. Really, it's the problem. Father Fraser hasn't gotten that cliff note yet. So. Anyway.
Do all Episcopal churches offer communion as frequently as this, or are there variations within?
I think now, since the late 70s, the overwhelming majority of Episcopal churches offer communion every Sunday. They may not offer it as frequently during the week, but I think the overwhelming number of Episcopal churches, I think we may have been one of, before I got here, we may have been one of 2 or 3 parishes in the diocese that did not. We had second and fifth Sundays, like this Sunday, where we have morning prayer and communion. They just had morning prayer and sermon. Which I found very funny because there was a little period in between. Father, would you go around the kitchen and answer? That's the door phone. Somebody's ringing the door in the back. That there were times when they would get a visiting clergyman, but it'd be the second Sunday, and so they wouldn't have to do communion. That seemed very funny to me. You know, when they were in the interim between Father Mike being the regular supply and not. So it is certainly much more the practice, and it's really a revival of the ancient practice of the church. I have my little blurb about, actually it's in the teaching notes, morning prayer and communion, where it talks about that just, it fell out of practice. And as the church became less sacramentally oriented, they, morning prayer took the place. Now here at St. John's, this was considered a purple Catholic parish. To have an urban parish in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, offering Holy Communion 5-6 times during the week was really quite unheard of. And yet, for the 3 main Sunday morning services, 8 o'clock was always communion, and then the 9 and the 11 alternated between communion and morning prayer. So again, there was still that whole, so the thought was if you want to receive communion every Sunday, you've got to alternate services. And I remember, I don't know if it's still true at Cranbrook, but I do remember a time, they have 2 services now, but Christ Church Cranbrook in Bluefield Hills, when I was in seminary and before, my parents lived up that way. If I was going to go there on a Sunday, I had to call ahead and find out which of the 2 services they were doing communion at, or just go to the 8 o'clock service. So, but now I think it's one of the things that has been restored in the Episcopal Church for the most part. Turn off the tape for a moment and say that what happened was the Catholic principle in the Church of frequent reception of the Holy Communion and the Communion as the primary service has won, but it's been stripped of the theology. We've got a lot of form, and a lot of the Episcopal churches are missing the substance. They're doing Holy Communion every Sunday, they don't know why. They don't know what they're doing. It becomes the Protestant community meal and remembrance meal rather than the actual participation of Christ's sacrifice. It's one sacrifice, his sacrifice, but it's our participation and making present. I'm getting way ahead of my notes here. And literally receiving Christ under the forms of bread and wine, that real spiritual presence. To be spiritual is more present than earthly presence. And so we've adopted I've seen Unitarians wearing chasubles, you know, and so there's certainly been a strange shift there. Yes.
One thing I wondered about the Eucharist is the Eucharist a weekly forgiveness of sins?
It certainly is a participation. Remember during the service, when we turn around, Father Fraser, I turn around and bid the form for confession, not at morning prayer, but at the communion service in full. That says, "And take this sacrament to your comfort." And so it is actually, you know, at first reading you think they're talking about the sacrament of confession, but they're actually talking about is the sacrament of communion. And so it is a participation in that forgiveness. So yes, absolutely. So that's why we confess our sinfulness before, as a recognition of our need, and turn around and do that. Okay.
It would be fun at some time to do the anointed mass.
Do the what?
To do the anointed mass.
Anointing?
Annotated?
Oh, to have something in the sidelines. And we do have a little booklet, by the way. Are they selling? We're all out. I'll have to order some more. It's published by the Prayer Book Society, and you've seen this yet? It's got the service, the Holy Communion service on one side of the page, and on the other side of the page is an explanation of all the rubrics of what's happening. Did I give you a copy of that board? Yeah. And so it is a very nice, helpful hint to know what's going on either side of it. So anyway, Jesus is present in the sacrament because he says so, not because we believe it. Which is part of the reason why we can reserve the sacrament. That when there's hosts that are extra from Sunday, we can reserve them in the aumbrey at the side of the altar area. And then when one of our shut-ins needs communion, we can take the communion to somebody who's sick, or if somebody's in extremis and they're about to die, we can take the sacrament to them in an emergency, because Jesus is present in that sacrament is there because he's there, not because the community is here, and so therefore we believe he's here. Okay. All right, we've got.
Sounds like a chicken neck that blew on.
Yes. Well, the chicken in this case is. Well, I don't know if I want to call her a chicken or an egg. So. We'll go from there. Yes, sir.
In the sacrament of baptism, is the faith of the parents and the godparents thought of as being applied to the child, or is it just sort of more of a promise to bring them up in the faith?
It's more of a promise in the service.
Okay.
And the understanding is that God is doing the baptism. I think it would be very hard to baptize a child for the parents having no faith, because then they're promising to raise the child in something for which they're not participating.